Good morning. We are ready for another recording from your amazing AP Bio 2 teacher. When we left off in class last time, we left off talking about evidences for evolution. So if you remember correctly, the evidences that I presented to you in class were direct observation, fossil record, biogeography, comparative embryology, homology, including vestigial structures. Then we talked about convergent evolution, and lastly we ended with molecular biology, or the similarities in DNA, proteins, genes, and gene products. So make sure that you know all the evidences for evolution. So today's topic, we're going to start on the slide with microevolution. Okay, and we're going to talk about the word micro. Just think about your root word. Micro means very small. So it's not small evolution in terms of the big picture. It's small in terms of it's at the molecular level. It's at the gene level. Okay, so the definition, microevolution, is a change in the gene pool of a population over a succession of generations. So let's define gene pool. A gene pool is the genetic makeup, okay, genetic makeup of a population. And in common terms, it's basically all of the copies of every type of allele at every locus. Okay, it's all the copies of every type of allele at every locus in all members of a population. So it's kind of when we talked about Hardy-Weinberg. At the beginning of this unit, I introduced Hardy-Weinberg first. It didn't really fit with the flow of what I was teaching you, but I wanted to teach it to you first. You had time to practice with Hardy-Weinberg. So if you remember in Hardy-Weinberg, when we went through the formula, we were looking at the frequency of the little or homozygous recessive allele. We looked at the little f versus the big F. And then with that, we could look up the genotype. We could look at the homozygous recessives versus the heterozygotes versus the homozygous dominants, and we could figure out the frequency of those in a certain population. So when you look at microevolution, you can look at the shifting of those. If it's not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, if things are happening, then you can see the allele frequency shift, and that would mean that that population is evolving at the genetic level. Therefore, it's displaying microevolution. Okay, so one more time, microevolution is a change in the gene pool of a population over a succession of generations. Okay, and that gene pool is genetic makeup of a population. In other words said, all copies of every type of allele at every locus in all members of a population. Okay, now what are some causes for microevolution to occur? Well, you should be able to tell me this already, because these are the things that Hardy-Weinberg, in order for Hardy-Weinberg to stay in equilibrium, we talked about the 5 things that must remain constant, or that must occur for Hardy-Weinberg, to stay in equilibrium. So obviously, the 5 main causes of microevolution are going to be the opposite of what would be required for Hardy-Weinberg. Okay, so in other words, for Hardy-Weinberg to remain, and for alleles to remain constant in a population, you must have no mutation. Okay, well in this case, if we have mutations, that can cause allele frequencies to shift, which can lead to evolution of that population. Okay, the second one is nonrandom mating. What do we mean about nonrandom mating? That would be such as inbreeding. Okay, if it's not inbreeding, it's artificial selection. You selecting who's going to mate with who. Okay, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, you'll notice they're in red. Those are really, really important. In fact, those are the 3 main mechanisms. Okay, these are the 3 main mechanisms behind changing the allele frequency, and that is natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. And I'm going to talk about these 2, genetic drift and gene flow, in the next couple of slides, but you should know very well what natural selection is because of the last couple slides that we talked about. So remember, natural selection, just to reinforce that, is where organisms that are best suited for the environment are going to survive. They'll pass those traits onto their offspring, and so through a succession of populations of generation after generation, the traits that are most suited for the environment, those adaptations that are coded for in the DNA, are passed on to their offspring. Okay, so those are the 5 main causes for microevolution to occur. Okay, now, just to give you an idea, I'm going to give you a little bit of background of when this was first, not really first, but one of the cases behind us looking at microevolution. I'm going to give you a scenario. In 1977, the medium ground finch, which was a seed-eating bird in the Galapagos, was there in quite a big population. Okay, there was a drought that killed all but 180 birds, and the only seeds available were large hard seeds, And so in that population, the birds that had a larger, deeper beak were better suited, and therefore they survived at a higher rate. So after the drought, okay, what you saw, the evolving population was the one that was best suited for the environment, and that would be an example of through natural selection. So all of the population of these medium ground finches, they had variety. Okay, they existed in a variety of choices because not every single bird has the exact same shape of a beak. It was slightly different in some of those. So variety or variation existed in that population, but due to the drought and the production of the certain seeds that were larger, only the birds that were adapted to crack those shells open and could eat the seeds are the one that would survive. And so that would show you a microevolution example through natural selection. Okay, we're going to talk about the genetic drift and the gene flow in just a second, but I just wanted to give you an example of natural selection because that's what Darwin saw. It's the same thing with his tortoises. Okay, so let's elaborate a little bit on genetic drift. Okay, genetic drift, let's look at the word, gene drifting, okay, genetic drift, is changes in a gene pool due to chance events. Okay, this is more often seen in small population sizes, and it tends to reduce genetic variability. Okay, so it's a chance event that reduces genetic variability. There's two situations that we're going to talk about, bottleneck and founder effect, but both of which are going to reduce variation and can definitely change the allele frequency in that population because whoever is better suited is going to survive. Okay, so we're going to talk about both of those. So in the next slide, if I can get this, hang on. All right. Okay, so let's talk about genetic drift in a little bit more detail. So you might want to write on the top of your slide, these are examples of genetic drift. Okay, so the first example, bottleneck effect. Let me first explain to you why it's called bottleneck effect before I explain to you how this relates to microevolution. Okay, if you take a bottle, and let's say it's got a long neck on it like this, and I'm going to say, I'm not a very good artist, don't laugh at me. Okay, so there you go, there's a bottle. If you were to put equal numbers of two variety of marbles, let's say here you go, I'm going to put, these are blue, okay, and then I grab red marbles and I put them in an equal variety, an equal number of those. Okay, so basically there exists an equal number of blue marbles and red marbles in the bottle. If those are representing your population, okay, I have a pretty equal spread of blue versus red. That's a pretty varied population. So the word is that's got a variety in it. And you want to think about some of those would be, let's say, big F, some are big F, and some are little f, little f. And you might have that the dominant allele represents one color and the recessive allele represents the other color. Okay, so you've got a variety in this population. Well, if you shake this bottle up and you turn it upside down, okay, now I'm going to attempt to draw this bottle upside down. Don't laugh, but here we go. And you shake it, and all those marbles are trying to come out of the neck. You can't predict which marbles are going to come out of the neck of this because maybe, just saying here, what if when you shook it upside down, more red ones came out than blue ones? You had, let's say, 5 red and only 2 blue that came out. Well, if that represented your surviving population, okay, so something happened, let's say a disaster, and it killed off most of the blue ones, and so all you had that came out were mostly red, that's your surviving population, and they're going to reproduce, because remember, they're better suited, and they're going to pass their traits on to their offspring. So because you have more red, they're going to represent a larger portion of your new population. So as they reproduce over time, you'll have a higher proportion of red marbles versus blue marbles. Okay, now, here are the kind of things that could make this happen. This might be an example of a volcano. Okay, this could be some natural disaster, like a volcano, a hurricane, a tornado. You get the picture, right? They're natural disasters that do not just hit one member of a population. Like volcanoes are not going to go, oh, let me just kill out all the blue marbles. It's not like that. It's whatever is in the line of fire, it's a matter of chance as to what is going to be killed off. And so if, as a result of this natural disaster, if you have more members surviving that are of a certain representative, they're going to be like reproducing at a higher rate, and they're not going to be, like your new population is not going to be representative of what the original looked like. Okay, so let me show you an example. Okay, in this scenario, here are some ladybugs that exist in yellow versus red. Okay, and they're pretty equally distributed. They're variety. This is the original population. Well, if the natural disaster occurred, and for whatever reason all the yellow ones happened to be on this side over here, and the yellow ones were killed by a volcano or hurricane, tornado, whatever, and all you had that survived were these two little red ones, well, they're going to reproduce and pass their traits on to the offspring, and so you're going to have your new population, okay, this is the new population, is not going to look like what the original population was in the beginning. Okay, this example is known as bottleneck effect. Okay, like I said, this happens, usually it's like on an island, let's say. This occurs more often in small populations, but they're still varied. So if you had an island, let's say in the Caribbean, and a hurricane did come through, and it's not going to select which members the hurricane at these high-speed winds are going to destroy which organisms. It's not selecting a certain organism. It's just a matter of chance. So something like a volcano, a hurricane, or tornado, if this occurred, it's more evident in a smaller population that this happens in. Okay, so the idea is it's going to reduce genetic variability. Okay, reduces genetic variability, so the surviving population is no longer a genetically representative of the original population. Okay, that's bottleneck. Okay, the second example, and we're talking about genetic drift. Okay, don't lose sight of what we're talking about here. This is founder effect. Okay, this is due to colonization by a limited number of individuals from a parent population. Okay, so think of the word founders. This would be an example of, let's say, the Amish. You guys probably watch the show Breaking Amish, right? Well, they don't usually break Amish, so their population, the Amish population, if you look in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, they tend to mate with people in their same population. So even though they're a population within the U.S. population of individuals, they're kind of like a small population. Well, if they decided to get up and move to a remote island, and this could be anybody, it doesn't have to be Amish, but let's say you had, like, this was your original group of members, and some of these decided to go colonize a new location. Okay, so a group of them came over here. Well, if there was a certain allele that was common among a few of these, and it was represented in a couple of these, and they reproduced, you might see the frequency of that allele explode in this smaller population. Okay, I'll give you an example of when this can occur, because this has happened before. In the early 1800s, there was, hang on, actually, I'm going to give you a different example. I'll talk about the retinosa one. Okay, there was a frequency of an allele called retinosa pigmentosa. Am I on pause still? Oh, no. Okay, sorry about that. I thought I was on pause. I saw it said pause at the bottom, and I was kind of freaking out about that. So anyway, let me give you the example of founder effect of when it has happened in a human population. In 1814, early 1800s, there were 15 British colonists that founded a settlement on Tristan da Cunha. It's a couple of islands between Africa and South America. One colonist carried a recessive allele for retinitis pigmentosa. It causes blindness. Okay, so imagine this. We're going to call it little r. If you have little r, you get retinosa pigmentosa. It's spelled like this. Retinosa pigmentosa. So if you are homozygous recessive, you get retinosa pigmentosa, which is blindness. It's one form of blindness. Okay, so when these 15 British colonists founded this settlement on this remote island, okay, between Africa and South America, one of them carried the allele for it. So they were big R, little r. Well, I want you to know that out of the original 15, okay, over time, there were 240, okay, new members after reproduction over several generations, and of the 240 descendants, 4 of them had retinosa pigmentosa. Okay, so if you're going, well, how is that possible? The person who is big R, little r has a child, right? Let's say they're big R, little r. They have children, and they have children, and they have children. Okay, if somebody else also comes to the island and they have big R, little r, and they mate, well, you can have little r as a child. Okay, well, even though they're blind, it doesn't mean that they can't have children, so they can still pass that allele on to their offspring. So over many, many, many generations, okay, you can have the higher proportion of retinosa pigmentosa, this disease, show up in the population over time. Okay, so, but you have to have, from the beginning, you have to have colonization of a few of these, okay, a few members that go to a new island and start their new population. So their gene pool is different than their source population. You might see this, let's say if you have, I'm just giving this as an example, but certain insects that blow with a storm, that blow from one island to another island it's not inhabited. So maybe some insects blow from one island to the other island and their new population is not representative of what the source population was. Okay, this is also, by the way, how Tay-Sachs disease became more common among the Ashkenazic Jewish population. So members who tend to stay within their own population, if they go and colonize to a different area and they're carriers for diseases, then you can see those alleles show up more common in their new population, different than what the population was in the beginning. Okay, now let's talk about gene flow. Okay, this is another example of microevolution. Okay, notice it's gene flow, not genetic drift. You have to get those two separated. This one, gene flow, is an exchange due to the migration of fertile individuals or gametes between populations. This tends to reduce differences, okay, reduce differences between populations. So in other words, we're reducing that genetic variability as well. It's transfer of alleles into or out of a population due to the movement, okay, of fertile individuals. So I have on the screen, you see this issue of Time magazine. This is from a couple of years ago. But they published this issue called The New Face of America, and it was how immigrants are shaping the world's first multicultural society. Because a long time ago, before we had mass transportation, airplanes, and ways to travel between even continents, countries or continents, then people tended to reproduce within the members that were in the same area. But now that we have ways to travel to other countries, it's not unusual for somebody to travel to another country, fall in love with somebody, and have children, and therefore we have a very diverse population. So what you're seeing is the reduction of differences. We're starting to see ethnic groups, cultural groups, having children with each other through biracial relationships. And so you're coming to get like a new face which has multiple ethnic groups all kind of blended together, because the gene flow is occurring between members of different areas. So humans move much more freely about the world, which makes us mate across populations, so eventually we're getting fewer differences. If it's extensive enough, if you have extensive gene flow, it can result in two populations combining into a single population with a common gene pool. So it's kind of interesting, how this can happen. There have been several examples of this. I'll give you one with mosquitoes. There's been a spread of several insecticide-resistant alleles among it's called the Culex pippins. It's the mosquito vector of West Nile virus, and it arose by a mutation in a few geographic locations, but now the alleles are becoming so frequent that they're common among several different mosquito groups, and so they're resistant to certain insecticides, which could be bad for us, which is why West Nile is on the rise. But you can see in the picture in the bottom, when you look at this, you can see that if this is your original population and you've got this other population over here, look at the differences that occur. But over time, if some of these travel over there and some of these travel over here, then these two populations will start to look more alike, and eventually it'll reduce the differences among them. So it'll kind of be like a varied this one and a varied this one, but they're not varied between each other. So when we say it reduces genetic variation, it's because this population and this population become very similar to each other because of flowing. Gene flow is common among a lot of populations today. Okay. Okay, the next example of microevolution, one of the causes of microevolution, is mutations. Okay, and this is actually the raw material for natural selection. If you see this, raw material for natural selection, mutations occur and are the raw material because they create variation, but yet whatever mutation is more beneficial is the one that's going to be passed on to the offspring. What I mean by that, if you look over here on this diagram, okay, let's say this is the example of the first, what's common in a population, this color. Well, let's say a mutation occurs and creates variation. Okay, so these dots are representing like a variety. So you've got this white one, this light gray one, and a dark gray one. Well, you guys know that through natural selection, maybe some of these are more suited for the organism. It's a better adaptation. So if this white one is an unfavorable mutation, it's selected against, which means if you are this, whatever that's representing, let's say it's a color, who knows what it might be representing, it's a certain trait, if you're this white one, you're selected against. So then these two are more favorable, okay, so unfavorable mutations are selected against, these are more favorable, they reproduce, okay, so as this one reproduces more of these, this one reproduces more of these, reproduction and mutation occur. Once again, more favorable mutations. Well, now let's say it's more favorable to have these two, so these are selected against. So over time, you end up getting, through natural selection, the most fit individuals, the most fit members of a population, and they reproduce and pass their traits on to their offspring. So mutation is a change in an organism's DNA. You guys already know that. We've covered that before. And if it happens to the gamete, then it's present through many generations, because the gametes are the sex cells that are passed on to new members. And it's the original source of genetic variation. So like I said, it's the raw material for natural selection. So if this occurs, then you can have changes in a population in the gene pool over time. So it's just one more example of how the gene pool can be changed in a population. Okay, the next example, we're almost done with these, by the way. The next example is nonrandom mating. Okay, so one more time, this is a main cause. This is a cause for microevolution to occur, which is a change in the gene pool of a population over time. Okay, so look at the first one, inbreeding. This reduces fitness by putting an individual at a greater risk of harmful recessive traits. For example, you guys are very familiar with dog breeding, right? Okay, well, you guys know that today it's not uncommon to have dog breeding to get these teacup varieties. Okay, like teacup poodles, teacup Yorkies, etc., which are very tiny dogs. So what they're selecting for is dog size. Why? Because some people prefer to carry a dog in a little purse and take them to work. And so they want to have like the tiniest dog that weighs 2 pounds or 3 pounds because they think they're cute and they can take them to work with them. Well, that's unlike where dogs naturally came from. Dogs evolved from wolves, which was a very large dog. And so over time, by selecting for dog size, by using that as a selecting factor, sometimes you have harmful recessive traits that cause such severe mutations in dogs that they die. Like, I don't know if you guys realize this, but sometimes when they get these teacup dogs, they might have two dogs in the litter that survive, but they may have had like 4 of them that died because they were so severely deformed, and it's because sometimes they inbreed and mate them with other litter mates that were also small. So this is kind of like not a good thing, but it also reduces, can change the genes in the gene pool. Okay, assortative mating is an example. Go ahead and put a star by this. This one is interesting. It's where individuals with similar genotypes or phenotypes, of course, we're looking at this, the physical appearance, but individuals with similar phenotypes, which is encoded for by your genotype, mate more frequently than expected. And you go, what? That's kind of weird. For example, if you were looking for a certain body size, body shape, and this happened among humans, maybe somebody who's really tall tends to find somebody really tall that they want to mate with. There's actually a study done with MIT graduates. Okay, this is a real study with MIT graduates. What they looked at is a lot of MIT graduates, due to their extra intelligence level, would select other engineering grads or other really intelligent grads. And so now they're looking at autism and how it's more common among MIT grads. And so they're studying, the frequency of the autism disease, okay, or disorder. They're looking at the frequency of that in the alleles among that certain population, which is super intelligent. And then the other one is they're looking among some, religious groups. Like if you have a certain religious belief and you only marry and choose mates within that religious belief, it's known as assortative mating because you're choosing people with similar phenotypes as you, and eventually some of those diseases or alleles become more frequent than expected. It can have an impact on a population. So assortative mating is non-random mating where individuals with similar genotypes or phenotypes mate with one another more frequently than expected. Okay, an example is individuals with similar body size tend to mate, or certain things. It does not change the frequency, but increases the proportion of homozygous individuals. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys write that. Does not change the frequency of the alleles, it changes the proportion of homozygous individuals. Homozygous individuals. And so if you go, well, how is that possible? Because homozygous individuals, it changes the proportion of those, not the frequency of the individual alleles. So you can change this, homozygous individuals, without changing the frequency of just the big A versus the little a. It just changes the proportion that would be homozygous. Does that make sense? Okay, so I believe we have one more. Okay, this is our last slide for this video. I know you're excited, but it's also important. Don't take this one lightly. This is a very important slide because this is one of the main, put a big star by that, one of the main causes for microevolution, and it's natural selection. Okay, now you guys know this very, very well, but I'm just going to go over a few things here. Natural selection is a blend of chance. Okay, highlight this, chance and sorting. What do I mean by that? Well, it's chance in the creation of new genetic variations, but it's sorting because natural selection favors some alleles over others. Okay, because of this, natural selection is not really random. Natural selection consistently increases the frequencies of alleles that provide reproductive advantage and thus lead to adaptive evolution. So what do I mean by that? Okay, well, look at the next term, relative fitness. How fit an organism is how fit it is to contribute to the gene pool of the next generation. We also look at this as, and I'm going to put a star by this, it's reproductive fitness. I think I mentioned this in class. But your fitness, how fit you are, is how reproductively fit you are. What contribution are you making to the gene pool of the next generation? Okay, so that fitness can kind of entail two things. I mean, think of the things that Darwin talked about. It's struggle for existence. Okay, and it deals with struggle for existence. Well, how do you struggle? How do you overcome that? Well, some organisms are adapted for that struggle, but it's kind of misleading because it makes you think of this picture. Okay, where this picture you have two males battling it out to try to see which one is going to be the one to, win the girl over in terms of reproductive fitness, like which one is the best. It's not always like that. Fitness can be very subtle. It might be a barnacle that it's better fit because it's more efficient at capturing food, therefore may capture energy better, and therefore may be able to produce more eggs. So it doesn't have to be battling it out like you see in this picture. It could be. In some organisms, some males do battle it out, but it's not always like that. Sometimes it's very subtle. So it's struggle for existence, and it's also survival of the fittest. Okay, those are the two things, survival of the fittest. So struggle for existence, survival of the fittest are the two aspects of how fit you are, but basically we're talking about your reproductive fitness. Okay, like how good are you at reproducing, and do you have those beneficial alleles? So for example, that barnacle that I was talking about, that's very efficient at capturing food and therefore produces a lot of eggs, and those eggs, can reproduce, grow into new barnacles, then that barnacle would be fit. It's not based on, how strong is the barnacle, it's how adapted is it. It's more fit at being able to capture food, therefore it can produce more eggs. So its fitness, its reproductive fitness would be very high. Okay, natural selection, if you look at this last bullet down here, this last little arrow, natural selection is the only form of microevolution that deals with adaptation because it's organisms with the best traits survive and pass those, alleles onto their offspring. So it's the only one that adapts the population to its environment. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go back a couple slides before I end this video. I just want to show you where we went with this video so that if you're studying, you know what to deal with. It's this first slide. Okay, what I took you on right now, we talked about microevolution, which was a change in the gene pool of populations over successive generations, and there were 5 main causes, but the 3 main out of those 5, like the ones that are most commonly seen, are natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. Okay, remember natural selection, survival of the fittest, struggle for existence. Genetic drift would be like the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. Gene flow would be like migration between two populations, making the resulting population not as varied. And then don't forget your other 2, but these are the 3 main that occur. Okay, So those are examples of microevolution, and we are done.